Ready.
Good evening. My name is Liz Igra. I'm the president of the Central Valley Holocaust Educators Network, and it is my privilege to welcome you all to the discussion of the documentary Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance. Tonight's film discussion will include a panel of 5 very special guests. The evening will include a conversation among the panel and an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Please note that this program is recorded. And it is now my honor to introduce our guests. Wow, Shari Rogers. She's the director of the film. Shari is president and founder of Spill the Honey, a Michigan-based nonprofit that promotes human dignity and advances public knowledge of the Holocaust and civil rights movement. She also serves as a trustee of the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy. What a woman. Reverend Kevin Ross, often called Rev Kev, which just shows you how beloved he is. Sorry, technology. Sorry, my apologies. So Rev Kev, what a way to be called. And he is a celebrated life coach, radio show host, leadership consultant, and author. He travels and speaks internationally and has shared the stage with great luminaries such as Dalai Lama, Nelson Mandela, Wright Edelman, and even Oprah. Rev Kev is an ambassador of Reverend Dr. King's nonviolent message to social change and is beloved by the community. Rather, the name of the organization is, and he is beloved by the community. Dr. Bruce Haynes is a professor of sociology at UCD and senior fellow in the Urban Ethnographic Project at Yale. He's an expert on race, ethnicity, and urban society. His work crosses disciplinary boundaries of American studies, community and urban sociology, race and ethnic relations, and Jewish studies.
You hear her easily.
Among his published works is a book I highly recommend to all our CVHAN teachers. It's Down the Up Staircase. It's a story of 3 generations of a Harlem family. It is he co-authored it with his wife, Sima Solovich. And Dorothy Landsberg. Wow, I've always wanted to meet her in person. Is an associate professor of lawyering skills and at McGeorge School of Law. Please forgive my accent. I am a foreigner. As a college student, Dorothy worked for the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Justice Department. She summarized the FBI reports on KKK Black voter suppression activities in Mississippi. She later returned and worked directly for Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient. She is a recipient. I am sorry. She helped develop the factual record for the U.S. House of Representatives impeachment inquiry during the investigation of President Nixon's involvement in Watergate. Dorothy teaches and participates in McGeorge Legal Clinic, community-based justice organizations, and is an active member of Congregation of Israel and its Racial Justice Committee. Brian, her husband, Brian Landsberg, is Professor Emeritus of McGeorge School of Law. In the 60s, he was involved in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where he went to court to protect the voting rights of African Americans in Alabama. His work included the historic case recognizing the right to march from Selma to Montgomery, and some of the first cases to desegregate public accommodations and enforce fair employment and housing laws. He continued his work on civil rights cases as chief of the department's education and appellate sections. Today, Brian continues to promote civil rights through his teaching and as chair of the amicus committee of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. And he is an active member of the Congregation of Israel and its Racial Justice Committee. He has published books on civil rights and has a book coming out shortly, Revolution by Law, the Federal Government and the Desegregation of Alabama Schools. I also want to acknowledge my teachers, the educators of the Central Valley Holocaust Educators Network, who will be using this film and this program as part of their studies and integrate it into their work on social justice. I also want to introduce the person who has made this possible and has offered many educational films to our community. Tevin, lovingly called our Tevin, director of the Sacramento Jewish Festival. Tevin, please, it's your turn to tell us more about this wonderful program we're about to participate in.
It would help to unmute. So thank you, Liz, for the introduction. I'm so pleased to see all of you here. So I also wanted to mention that this film is part of the social justice film series that we put together. We have 5 co-sponsors. We have the Greater Sacramento NAACP, we have the Sacramento Jewish Film Festival, we have the Jewish Community Relations Council, and there are, I can't see all the people, but there's at least, I can see at least 5 or 6 members of JCRC on this call. So thank you all for being on the call. Also, sponsors include Sacramento Faces Race, and of course, CV Hen, that Liz is president of. So we have 2 prompts for the esteemed panel members that we've assembled here. The chats are gonna be, the prompts rather are in your, are gonna be posted in the chat. So I'm gonna read the first one. Would like to ask each panel member to share with us a little of your history as it relates to the subject of this film. What aspects of your experience give you a unique perspective on this? And given that experience, what are your perspectives on what you saw in the film? Shari, would you like to start?
Oh, sure. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody, and I'm always just taken back because I'm not a historian. I have my PhD in clinical psychology, but this esteemed panel is just extraordinary. And with each film festival that we do virtually, it's like this becomes another educational platform to really educate on the history of the Black Jewish coalition. And I just feel so excited by what we're doing and so grateful. So my own personal history is I'm a Jewish woman, and I've studied, I'm very interested, and I've, care about of course, Jewish identity. And the first film I did was on PBS in Detroit. It was about a Yad Vashem Holocaust survivor whose mother's departing gift before he would go on to live and survive in 5 concentration camps was a jar of honey. And he grew up Orthodox, and his mother said it was beshert, it was meant to be that he should survive. And so she gave him this cup of honey. It broke, but he held on to his mother's benediction to survive. And when I met him at Yad Vashem in Israel, I was so inspired by his story that I asked him if anybody had done a documentary on him. And fast forward, I ended up doing a documentary on him. But when I was in Poland, he said that he had met this Christian man from Tufts University who was also inspired by him, so much so that he founded the Institute for World Justice after meeting him, and brought him to Boston. And we ended up doing a documentary about the people he inspired. And it's a beautiful story, but I also had brought, there was about 40 Black ministers that were in Israel. So I brought them to meet Eli Ezer Ayalon in Israel. So that was the first film that I did. And in terms of this film, I met Clarence Jones at the Charles Wright Museum in Detroit. And he had just written a book called "What Would Martin Say?" And he was a professor at Stanford University on Dr. King's legacy, because he was his personal attorney among many attorneys, but he was his Dr. King's personal attorney from 1961 to 1968, and he also was his speechwriter. And so the chapter that I had heard at the Charles Wright was on anti-Semitism. And Dr. King had specifically spoke to Clarence Jones weeks before he was murdered, and said that he used the word Negro at the time, if our Negro brothers are ever talking about our Jewish brothers, it will be you, Clarence, to remind our Negro brothers of the 24/7 commitment that the Jewish people had to our struggle. So we developed a friendship, and it's a long story, but it's a long story, so I want to give everybody the time, but basically he has helped me and introduced me, along with Susanna Heschel, to all the living witnesses, as he says, the lions, to tell their story about what they observed and about this coalition.
Devin, you're on mute.
Sorry. I have to remember that. So who'd like to go next? Bruce Haynes, do you want to go next?
Sure. Although you said I only had a few minutes, and I could probably spend a real long time talking about my connections to the Jewish community. So first, the most obvious one, I'm born and raised in New York, grew up in Harlem. But more importantly, my grandmother, Elizabeth Ross Haynes, was a member of the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews during World War II. And both my grandmother and grandfather were both social scientists who began their careers in the early part of the century. When I wrote my book that Liz mentioned, I came to discover that my family owned the brownstone where the Jewish fraternity from CCNY held their meetings. We owned that up until somewhere around the late 60s or 70s. My father sold it to send us to private school. I wouldn't be a sociologist if it wasn't for a Jewish scholar by the name of Jay Shulman, who became my mentor and picked juries in New York and basically encouraged me to go to graduate school after he trained me as a social scientist. And I guess lastly is I most recently wrote a book about Jews of African descent, and I situate that book within the context of Black-Jewish relations. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. Rev Kev.
Thanks again for having me. I'm so delighted to be a part of this rich discussion. I enter this discussion from a faith perspective, and I relate to the film from that perspective. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and my faith tradition, which is unity, has at its bedrock this idea of people from different faith backgrounds coming together to work towards solving our common challenges. And so when I was growing up, the voice that spoke most clearly to me about this, that was able to infuse these various worlds together, was that of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as has been mentioned. And of course, growing up African-American, believe it or not, my hero growing up was not Spider-Man or Superman, it was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When you came to my bedroom to visit me as one of my playmates, I had turned a bookshelf into a podium, and I would read and recite King's speeches to my friends before we played with Hot Wheels and Tonka trucks. There was something very profound in what he was saying that I naturally was oriented toward, and I wanted to, in some way, emulate his work. And so I studied at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. So coupling my unity background, which naturally compelled us to extend our branches over many fences and work toward interfaith and ecumenical harmony and this cross-racial kind of dialogue and interaction. This is my first language. This is how I grew up. Then I wanted to study where Dr. King studied. And so I went to Morehouse and graduated there, but I met my chief mentor there, the Reverend Dean Lawrence Edward Carter Sr., the Dean of the Martin Luther King International Chapel. And it was there that my whole world began to expand, and I began to kind of shape my philosophy and theology. And it was that of a liberation theology, that freedom would become the outcome of our work together across these divergent lines. And so I come to this conversation with a rich background as the senior minister of Unity of Sacramento National Spiritual Center, as the board member of Sacramento Area Congregations Together, where we're doing this work in real time, as a member of the Parliament of the World's Religions. And it is, I actually believe, what the film is pointing toward, the world that the film is pointing toward. So I'm engaging in that work because it's a world that works for all. And as an African American, I feel it's essential that I connect the challenge and the struggle and the changes that have come about from my ancestors to the communities that exist now that want to further that work. And so this film is a wonderful reservoir, very refreshing reservoir of history that I think will be a catapult for more of this work move forward.
Thanks. I also love Dr. King's speeches. My sister lives in Atlanta, and way back in the 70s, I went with her to the King Museum, and I bought, remember cassette tapes? I bought every one of his speeches that they had on cassette tape. So
Yeah.
I'd like to introduce now Dorothy and Brian Landsberg. So you're up now, please.
So I'll go first, and I thought that what I would do is talk about two examples where my personal history crosses the narrative of this amazing film. And Shari, it is a truly amazing film. And those examples both come from summers, the summer of 1963 and the summer of 1964. In the summer of 1963, a high school friend and I, we lived in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., took a bus down to the mall, and we marched in the March on Washington. A group of AFL-CIO people from Ohio took us under their wing. I still have the pin that I got there. It's one of my most prized possessions. And they fed us and gave us water. We, of course, weren't smart enough to do any of that. And we walked, we were early, and we walked, and we got between the Lincoln Memorial and the end of the reflecting pool in a spot where we could clearly see and hear Dr. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, the singing, and the other speakers. And it had a profound effect on me. I knew at the time that I was participating in something that was remarkable, and I was inspired by it, and I was moved by it. Through a series of circumstances, the next summer, between my junior and senior year in college, I had an opportunity to come and work for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. I could pass the clerk typist test, and they were hiring college students to do work that now will be referred to as paralegal work. And two forces came to bear that summer. One was that the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi was very active. And there were a group of FBI letterhead memorandum that were coming from the Bureau that tracked individual incidents of Ku Klux Klan organization, where they were geographically, how they were organized, their methods of intimidation, which included cross burnings and beats and church burnings, but none of it had been analyzed. And so I had a security clearance. Everybody who worked in the department did. So my very first day, I was given the responsibility by one of the lawyers who worked with John Doerr, D-O-A-R. He's actually the person that got the Medal of Freedom that both Brian and I worked with. And so I, in the next couple of weeks, put together what was later described as a 19-page, single-spaced analysis that described what was happening with the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. I got a map, and I was able to put dots on it and various things. The other force that was at work, besides the Klan in Mississippi, was something called COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, involving SNCC and CORE and SCLC and other organizations that were involved in voter registration. And those of you who are alive may remember also in 1964, there was Mississippi Freedom Democratic Summer, where they put together a slate because they were excluded from the Democratic Party, and they went to Atlantic City, and both Bob Moses and Fannie Lou Hamer were involved in that effort. So, but there were three young civil rights workers, James Chaney, who was a paid staffer from Mississippi, and two Jewish young men, Michael Schwerner and Andy, and they were Andy Goodman, and they were in training in Ohio. And then the night of June 21st, there had been a church burning in Mount Zion Baptist Church, which was in Philadelphia, near Philadelphia, Mississippi. And those three young men got in a car to go up to find out about it. And they were stopped for alleged speeding, they weren't speeding, by the sheriff of Neshoba County and by the deputy of Neshoba County, and they were put in jail. What we all know is the three civil rights workers. That night at 10:30, they were released. From the jail. And we later found out report that
Something's happening with the sound.
Yeah.
Dorothy and Brian, you're freezing up. What I would suggest is that you turn off your camera for a moment and see if it works better just with the audio.
Is that better?
Is that better?
So far,
Yeah.
so good. Thank you.
And so that report was put at the back of a notebook and actually had a fair amount to do with steps that were taken by the federal government to try to bring the Klan under control. So as I was watching, Shari, your movie, I was very struck by the fact that I had a personal part in some of the things that you related.
So I went to the Civil Rights Division as a lawyer in January of 1964. And I didn't realize it at the time, but three of my colleagues were Holocaust survivors. John Rosenberg, Judge Harold Green, who later federal district judge Harold Green, and Frank Schwab, later appellate judge in the District of Columbia. And John Rosenberg became my roommate. And I asked him why, how he had ended up working in the Civil Rights Division. And John had been in the Air Force before he went to law school. And he had African-American friends in the Air Force, and he talked about the way that they were treated, and that how came his reason for being interested in working as a lawyer in the Civil Rights Division. And John has had a very distinguished career as a public interest lawyer since then. So that is one connection, I guess. Dorothy and I both we know Clarence Jones. We've broken bread with him and been friendly with him. So it was wonderful to see him in the movie. And we also had some connections with John Lewis, and who we very much admired. And so it was great to see them. And I also actually, Bernard Lafayette was a young man who I saw him being interviewed by John Doerr about an incident where Sheriff Clark had beaten him up in Selma. I spent time in Selma, a lot of time in Selma in 1964 and 1965. I was there the day of the march and reported on it to my boss. And so that's part of my connection, I guess. The other is that I was the chair later, many years later, of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Sacramento, and where we made efforts to sort of renew the kind of relationships that the film portrays between African Americans and Jews. And as Reverend Kev said, I think that there's a very great commonality of interest among African Americans and Jews. That there was certainly evident in the days when Rabbi Heschel marched with Dr. King and became such a good friend with Dr. King. But I think that they're evident today. If you look back at what happened in Charlottesville, for example, which is also in the movie. So the two chants were Jews will not replace us, and something about whites, I can't remember, but the point being of white supremacy. So I think that my perspective on the film is that we had a lot of reason to work together in the 1960s and 70s, which the film portrays. We still have a lot of reason to work together today.
Yes, you're here.
Thank you all. So for the next part, for about a half an hour, panelists will address a second set of prompts. And don't wait for me to call on you. We intend this to be a free-flowing conversation. So I'd like to read the prompts, and then whoever would like to start out, please do. And again, this is just to talk among yourselves. So the questions are, and these are all in the chat as well, I hope. So how would you characterize the status of Black-Jewish relationships today? What can we do to improve that relationship? And with the rising climate of hate, nationally, globally, locally, towards Black people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, Jews in general, many with an othered identity, where do you see opportunities here in the Sacramento region to support one another and build bridges? So whoever would like to start.
Well, I just want to say that yesterday I got a call from our own Congresswoman in Michigan, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, who initiated the first Black Jewish caucus ever with Congressman John Lewis before he passed away. And she has asked to set up a virtual experience with Congress. So that's going to be really exciting. So I think she realized that our two communities, especially being first a mayor in Southfield and being very familiar with the Jewish people, she understood our history and Black Jewish relations, and so she thought it was time that there should be a caucus actually in Congress. And so I think that's the biggest thing that's really happened. There's grassroots organizations that have existed, especially the Andrew Goodman Foundation, and amazing work that goes on with American Jewish Committee, and I can go on and on and on, especially in Atlanta. There's a Black and Jewish community in Michigan. There's one going in Florida. But I think that there's a Black Jewish caucus in Congress now can help basically, make this the importance it really needs to be, because we can look at this history as a template for us where we go from here. That, we can have our differences, but we all have so much more to gain by sharing goals and figuring out how to make our cities safe. And there's so much to do together that it behooves us not to work together and achieve these goals.
So I would love to jump in at this stage and pick up on a theme of the movie, which was that friendship between King and Heschel, and how important that friendship was in allowing these two men to see each other's circumstances. And I wanted to go back, and I wanted to be brief because I know as a faculty member, I tend to drone on and on and on. But I do want to comment. I actually was 9 years old in 1969, and I was sent off to a predominantly Jewish elementary school in 3rd grade, and I made my first Jewish friend, a guy who lives in LA now, named Jack Neff, in 3rd grade. And for us and my Jewish friends that I've had since elementary school and high school, being able to try to talk about these issues still is not necessarily an easy thing to do. And so it really requires a commitment, an emotional bond that goes beyond superficial conversations. And so one of the things I just wanted to capture is this notion of trying to create situations where real friendships can be developed. Because right now we have a highly segregated society. Blacks and Jews no longer live in the same neighborhoods. They once did, maybe back in the 50s, but that's not true anymore. And so, there may be intellectuals who would have this conversation, but the average Jewish person, the average black person in their communities may not want to have this conversation or may not even see the need to have this conversation. And so I'd love to see situations that were really organic, that provided context for real friendships to develop.
I would love to just jump in on this conversation of friendships and relationships as it relates to our current state. I think like you, well, I was not born in the 60s, and so
I had a few years on the
you have a few years on me. And so I come into this conversation really in the 80s, as a student growing up and beyond. However, there's something that, to answer that first prompt about what is the state of Black-Jewish relationships in the United States today, I think it's varied. I think it's actually varied.
Yes.
And I think in contrast to the film, I think it's much more invisible than it was in the time of Dr. King. And what was beautiful about what the film brings to light, especially for those who might be skeptical or for those who may not know the history, it helps to close some gaps and reveal some things about our history and about our long-standing relationship between our communities, and possibly will help to provide some grace between our communities for those who have grown cynical about how we can be together across these lines. Another thing that was very important, that was modeled in the film, that I think is important for Black-Jewish relations today, is that we saw our communities come together predominantly through the leadership of faith leaders. And I think faith leaders play a significant role both in the Jewish community and in the Black community, because we do have this shared history of untimely ancestors created by race-based violence. We have that. We understand what that is. We have this shared interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures from the understanding of a necessity of a liberation theology. And we understand how to interpret that and communicate that so that people within our communities can more easily connect to one another. So there's a role that the faith community has, I think, and to build upon the relationships, or to make visible. And I think that this is one of the most profound things about the film, to make visible those existing relationships that happen. Often we have these relationships, between Blacks and Jews that are not known to the world. I'm thinking of one of my friends in New York who called me, said, "Rev Kev, I love you, and I'd love for you to come and perform my wedding." This is my buddy Andy out of New York, who's Orthodox Jewish. I said, "Well, how am I going to perform your wedding?" He says, "Well, you're going to do part of it, and then the rabbi's going to do the other part of it, but I got to have you there." And I think when we enter each other's lives, it's so important. When we enter each other's lives and we create these bonds around our commonalities, but our true interest in getting beyond the color barriers, So we developed this color bravery rather than color blindness. And so we start to form this color curiosity and cultural curiosity that says, you know what, Rev Kev, you know, I need you to come and join us for the Passover Seder. And I say, yeah, I'm coming. I want to know what this is all about, and I want to be a part of that. And I may not necessarily be able to articulate it all back, but there's something about it that's so very rich and precious to me because it's rich and precious to you, and vice versa. I want you to become a part of things that are unique to our tradition, and those bonds start to form, making them visible. I remember one of my colleagues, Rabbi Shmuley Botiak. Some of you may know the charismatic and controversial Rabbi Shmuley. But Rabbi Shmuley has always been one of those individuals in my life who has found a way to call me forward and call others forward from my community in order for us to stand together on important issues that really matter.
Kev, let me interrupt you for a second. I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
feel that the faith community has stepped up to the plate in the context of all the anti-Semitism and racism that we've witnessed over the past year?
I think Sacramento is a very unique place in this. I think we're phenomenal in that respect, particularly because of my connection to the Sacramento area congregations together, SAC Act. We stand shoulder to shoulder in so many instances. You know, it can be dizzying. And unfortunately, we've had to respond to so much hate, but we respond together, whether it's with Rabbi Mona, with Rabbi Seth, I can go on, but also Muslim leaders, the Council of American Islamic Relations, and I can just broaden the spectrum of what's happening. And Sacramento ACT is a member of a national organization, and that national organization is predominantly Christian, and they look to us as model for how we have become a multi-faith social justice organization that stands together to challenge hate every time it rises up. And so when synagogues are attacked, it may as well have been a Black church that was attacked as well. I am never without a phone call. I'm never without an invitation, and we bring our entire communities to this. And so I think we have some models in Sacramento that are really working and very healthy.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that they're models, because I feel that many faith leaders have not stepped up to the plate in a way that I would expect. And I'm not criticizing the local leaders. I'm simply saying that across the nation, whether we're talking about evangelical leaders or we're talking about Baptist leaders, I have not, at least they haven't been in the news that I've been watching, and that troubles me.
It is, and it is, I think, in great part due to ignorance. I think a great part due to ignorance, and going back to your original point about true relationships. I'm also a part of the American Leadership Forum, and one of the ways we engage across faith lines and sectors and a social standing is that we cohort for a year together, and we get to deeply connect around our essential story. So this necessity for us to connect deeply beyond the surface is essential to us then having the confidence to say we belong to one another. And friendship does not necessarily mean franchise, and unity does not necessarily mean uniformity. We don't have to always agree on everything, but there is something that makes me hold you closer when we're in conflict, when we don't agree, because I don't want to lose what I've spent so much time building up. Very recently, in response to the double pandemic that we're living in, one of racism and one of anti-Semitism, and one of now the social pandemic, we came together as Sacramento area congregations together, and we authored what we call the 10 Commandments for Dismantling Systemic Racism. And we walked through these powerful statements, and as a collective clergy act to model this for our community, we went to the state capitol and placed these 2 tablets. We created tablets that had the 10 Commandments for Dismantling Systemic Racism as a call out to our elected officials and other leaders of our guiding institutions. And Rabbi Seth Castleman worked very closely with me, along with various other faith leaders within our cohort. And so it is work that's being done, but in great part, it's invisible, and we need to emphasize the relationships that already exist more.
Well, I'd like to just jump in and say, it sounds to me like a lot's being done at the level of the faith leaders, but I don't know how much it is trickling down to those of us in the congregations. I was looking at the pictures of the people here on the Zoom call. There are a lot of white Jews on this call, and I bet that very few of us really have developed those close relationships, and we would like to, but I think that very few of us really have. So the question for me is, how do we take it from it being the relationships of the faith leaders and getting it down to the rest of the community?
I would like to say that I come from a different generation.
Oh, you're muted.
You went on mute. You muted yourself.
Mhm.
You're back, Sharon.
And I was brought up in Chicago in a Black neighborhood on 37th Street. My parents were, my father was from Russia. My mother was from England. They were immigrants, and we had a little grocery store there. And the community around became African-American. So my friends were African-American. I know I have white hair now, but because I played with these kids, they assumed I was Black. Or,
Yeah.
because that what the racial line was so strict. But my influences from my parents and their friends were from the labor movement in the 30s, that people were fighting for justice for everybody in the labor movement. And I was sort of radicalized during that time. And I knew in my neighborhood all these kids, and I also saw what was happening. I also met Paul Robeson once, but I also knew what was happening with the police, because I saw it. And I saw a lot of just really terrible things. But I think one of the things that still strikes me today is that women could not get abortions. Young people of my age who were getting pregnant and didn't have the health care or the right to get abortions, that's being clamped down on right now. And it really hit the Black girls than I knew. But I have always been connected to labor and left-wing groups like the Democratic Socialists of America. And I am a radical Jewish woman who is also a Unitarian Universalist, and I've gone to your church, Reverend. And there is a problem with, and I was a professor at CSUS too, with all the rest of you. So I just want to say, some of these problems are blatantly economic, and they have to be addressed from an economic point of view. And it's not just religion, because a lot of the people in the synagogue I'm now attending they don't know that they believe in some of the religion, but they believe in their heritage. And they're liberal, but we don't meet Black people very often because of segregated neighborhoods. Though I have Kenyan friends, I have other people that I reach out to. But ignoring the Jews in the labor movement, or the Irish, or a lot of people. They are all part of this community that wants everybody to be together and be friends with each other. And that's a fact.
Sharon, I think
Hold on a second. I just want to say for this segment, so just for everyone, we'd like to have this segment for the panel members, and we'll be opening it up to everyone following that.
But Sharon, you make a really, really important point. I grew up in New York City, and I went to CUNY Graduate Center. It was chock full of lefties of all stripes. My advisor, mentor, Jay Schulman, was fired from CCNY for protesting with Black and Puerto Rican students back in the 60s. And he founded the National Jury Project, which did pro bono work for defendants. And so I really know this left legacy you're talking about, and how deeply it was tied to Jews and Blacks working in factories together, Jews and Blacks living in Ocean Hill, Brownsville together. There are these really organic overlaps that placed common cause in labor politics that was so much stronger back in the 1970s than we have today. The Jewish community has, in fact, become economically rather successful from where it was in 1950. And so the shift to neoconservatism and conservative politics by a good segment of the Jewish community is, in fact, a fact. And so there's a huge shift that we're not talking about between the Jews of 1970 and the Jews of 2020.
I would agree with that, and I think that a lot of us are slow to recognize the privilege that accrues to us from being white, and that's something that we all need to work on. But I would hope that that's not going to stand in the way of developing relationships.
No, in fact, I think what you're bringing up is, in fact, exactly what's taking place right now within the Jewish community and across the Black and Jewish community. I just wrote a small piece for ESPN about, in response to Black celebrities who had engaged in some anti-Semitism over the past months. And it sort of raises the kinds of questions that we're talking about here in terms of the way in which the Jewish community has become involved in Black Lives Matter, and how that has sort of raised, I think, a reevaluation of the Jewish community, along with the internal diversity of the Jewish community that's taking place as Jews of color become more and more present within the Jewish community. So I see a lot of conversation taking place about, well, who are we? Are we white? Are we Jews? What does this all mean?
Of course, one of the most shocking things to me in the film was what happened in Ferguson, Shari, that you, I think you showed rabbi being sort of shut out from, is that, am I correct about that, Shari?
There wasn't time. The problem, thank God I was saying earlier that I have 80 hours of film footage, and that because we have a nonprofit that we're going to Spill the Honey Foundation, we're going to be taking our 80 hours and creating 6 to 8 minute videos and curriculum to supplement so that you can hear the whole story, because this particular film was about personal memories, personal relationships, and the relationship between Rabbi Susan Tall and Reverend Tracy Blackman is extraordinary. And it's a long story that needs to be a whole segment on them. But it just briefly, Rabbi Susan Tall, her church was in the inner city. before Michael Brown was murdered, her congregation would take care of graveyards, black graveyards. She has a lot of black Jews, so much so that Yavila McCoy made sure that some of the readings had images of black children in it. Even in the mosaic in her church there was, and they worked day in and day out together, and were with mothers whose children were lost. But of course, at the time, there was the Ferguson to Palestine, and that was a whole issue going on. And Rabbi Susan Talb's life was threatened, and they were at one big meeting where they weren't going to allow her to speak, and Reverend Tracy Blackman was the head of it. And so she basically said, and they had developed such a close friendship, that she basically said, if she doesn't speak, then I'm not going to speak. Now, that doesn't mean that they both, you know, their personal ideas about Israel and Palestine, whatever it didn't matter. Their friendship took a precedence, and what they were doing on the streets of Ferguson took a precedence, you know, despite, you know, the Israel-Palestinian issues.
You know, I think that's what I really wanted to try to bring out when I tried to focus on this aspect of friendship within your film, because I've had some very, very difficult conversations with friends. I mean, you know, hanging up the phone, we don't talk for 2 or 3 weeks, and then, you know, we somehow find a way to reconcile. And if it's without those deep feelings of that we're connected in some way, that we have, you know, a history between us that goes back, we would have parted company long ago. So I really feel this is why I really wanted to emphasize that piece of the film that I felt you really brought out. And for me, the relationship with King and Heschel, of course, was so significant.
You know, I just want to say one thing. I mean, when I was interviewing Congressman Lewis, and he was so close with Shari Frank, kind of like his Jewish soul sister. They rebuilt the Black Jewish Coalition in the early 80s. But right before, you know, he says at the end of our film, it was so poignant. He said, you know, we are all living in fear. And if Dr. King were alive today and Rabbi Heschel, wouldn't they be pulling together for those generations yet unborn? And I think he understood that they represent the best in both of our communities about seeing each other, hearing each other, and working for justice. So I think it was very powerful when he said that.
You know, I wonder if we fail in how we educate our children, and I mean both blacks and Jews, because I feel we no longer know each other's stories. I grew up during the 70s. I learned about the Holocaust. We had PBS movies. Even in college, we read The War Against the Jews. And so, you know, the conversation when you talked about racism, the conversation about anti-Semitism was right there. I don't think that's any longer the case. And I think that's deeply problematic for how people have, in a sense, concluded that Jews have become white folk, in a sense.
I think Dollinger's book, which you would know, Bruce, I think is very poignant, even in the 60s. I mean, Jews benefited from the Black Power movement. So when blacks were empowered and feeling more proud in their identities, Jews said, we can do the same thing for Jews in Russia. We can gather. And they had that kind of sense of, you know, pulling together. So there's so much of this shared history, not just about Jews helping the blacks, but it's also blacks empowering the Jews as well. Susanna Heschel says so beautifully that, you know, that we owe the civil rights movement to making our books that were burnt in the Holocaust coming alive through Dr. King. When Martin Luther King would talk about, you know, the Old Testament and bring up the story of Moses, you know, those were lost and they were burnt in fires through the Holocaust. And here her father's, Rabbi Heschel's sisters were murdered, and you know, it was Dr. King that brings this up and they bond together. So Dr. King, in a sense, brings the Jewish story to the central narrative in America. So, you know, she feels, and many others feel, a tremendous debt to the Black community as well.
You know, I think you bring up the issue of power potentially in terms of, you know, the Black community perceives the Jewish community as a deeply empowered community relative to the Black community. And that in and of itself creates a tension, I think, between the two communities. And that goes, of course, is related back to class again.
Yeah. And I think that this, you can't talk about this as we start looking at identity and the ways in which we know each other or don't know each other, but particularly as you're talking about younger generations knowing the history or not knowing the history, and how they are, they cannot determine necessarily by looking at someone who is Jewish that they are necessarily allies because they are white appearing. So it's very important for my Jewish brothers and sisters and relatives to recognize the importance of outing yourselves in times like these and making it clear of your position as it relates to issues affecting Black people who are suffering tremendously. And it will take an unprecedented courage for some because we've grown comfortable, or we don't have some pre-existing relationships that we can lean on, but we do have shared values, and those values may be the springboard, or conversations like these can be the springboard for you breaking with that white privilege or leveraging that white privilege in order to pull forward the history that we are talking about here in the film. So I think that's really important. Also, the economic chasm that exists between Blacks and Jews here in the United States, and particularly in the state of California, gives the sense, a not so great impression about how our relationship is to be. Employer, employee, store owner, customer. These dynamics have also need to be rethought. Artist, label owner. These are some ways in which we can begin to reimagine how that chasm can become more equal. So some of the ways in which the hesitation between moving together are those ways in which things are structurally in place. One of the things that I want to invite faith leaders and business leaders and political leaders of all strata, as we're talking about ways in which to really dismantle systemic racism, begin to look at communities that we care about, where Black people are, and start to examine what's missing and where you have benefited from the efforts of Blacks, whether that be as from your customer base, from Blacks who are living in properties that you own, from Blacks who may be in some way, or the legacy that we're talking about. When we start to think about that, what is your dream that you want to share with Blacks about the communities that keep systems of oppression in place? Check cashing stores, for instance, in Black communities, the lack of grocery stores and that exist where there could be something that's equivalent to what you have. How about coming together with faith leaders and business leaders and social engineers and helping us to reimagine what these communities can look like and become a part of that? Because there's a saying in the Islamic tradition: I must want for my brother what I want for myself. And so there becomes this sense of restlessness for me until my brother has the same freedoms and privileges and joys that I have. And so this is what I think is possible when we root down in our relationships. We start to build up our communities, and our communities are not closed communities. I think that's a very important distinction. I love hearing from Sharon how she's a part of multiple communities, you know, the organizing community and the Unitarian Universalist community, and that I become a citizen of all of these communities and I find ways to make inroads toward doing so. You know, I wear this ring that was created for me that bears the symbols of the great world's religions on it. And I do it intentionally as a symbol of friendship, but an intention to find a way to build bridges, find a way to start a conversation, find a way to establish some common ground. And I believe that is happening among many of our leaders here in Sacramento, certainly in the wake of the recent Stephon Clark, murder. We've seen a lot of those conversations begin, but we haven't gone far enough. And I want to add one more thing about ways in which we can move toward that friendship. And that is, we have to be careful not to establish preconditions around who can be a friend, because then we'd have to sanitize the whole world now, wouldn't we? So this sense in which we can't be engaged with each other in our communities because you might know someone or you may be affiliated with someone that we don't like. Well, that's the whole inhabited earth unable to get beyond that. And so I just want to bring that up because these are the kinds of things that Black people talk about when we're sitting at our kitchen tables about why some of the chasm may exist and how can we get beyond that. And I still feel strongly that the faith leaders play a significant role in modeling how this happens, whether we're hosting these conversations in our communities, whether we're standing up for justice alongside each other, linking arms. And challenging through our sermonizing and through forums like these, challenging us to think about the world that we're trying to build and who must we become in order to do that. And it takes a tremendous degree of courage and sometimes a breaking with traditions that have served a time, but it may be time to create traditions that can serve the time in which we live. And that's what's exciting about what we're seeing across the country now with this new movement that is challenging systemic racism and media entities that for the first time in American history really coming forward to name it and call it out and normalize the conversation, because there's power there to do it. And so with that, I think I've said far more than my share of time.
Well, Rev Kev, I'd just love to
I think
follow up on that and try to get back.
to the choir.
I'm sorry, Brian, go ahead.
I was just saying that I think that Rev Kev has been preaching to the choir, that most of us on this call probably agree that we want to combat racial injustice. We believe in economic justice and relationships and all that. And so that I think that we're in agreement. But then the question is, then what?
Hey, Lynn has asked for people to put questions in the chat. I think you've heard from all of us a lot. And or you can just raise your hand. I think people have been
Bruce
on this call a long time.
Bruce, you were about to say something.
Well, yeah, I wanted to say something that was going to connect back to your film. I thought what was one of the interesting things, in fact, was the way you laid out the narrative of the film. So it begins with kind of recognizing this Old Testament connection, right? Even in terms of how, our two faiths have placed justice at the center of both of these faiths. And then we talk about the civil rights era, and that kind of runs, it's pretty much the 20th century. And then I just wonder, because you end with a conversation with Black Lives Matter, and I wonder Does this mean that what we really should be talking about is the same thing that MLK was talking about, that Malcolm X was talking about, that we really should be talking about human rights at this point, that we really need to go sort of beyond the narrow scope and take a broader scope about justice in America?
I'd like to respond to that particular point. My name is Eric Corling. I'm a teacher in the Sacramento area in San Juan Unified School District. And I met John Lewis, 12 years ago as part of a program I did through the House of Representatives. It was the House Fellows Program. And it was, just even remembering it now, it was one of the most, wow, I'm an English teacher and I'm like struggling for words here, trying to put the experience of John Lewis into words. He let me sit in his chair while he talked with me. You know, he put me in, you know, a place where it's like, shouldn't you be sitting here? Because this is like your office and everything. He says, no, no, no. Okay, I want you to sit there and see from that position and let me talk to you about what I do and everything. And the biggest thing that I took away from him that just, I still have not been able to fully square it away with my own experiences and everything and just life. But the fact that he had absolutely no animus, no hatred at all toward anyone that had ever done him any wrong, that man could have gone through what he went through and have a heart just utterly pure of any kind of hatred, okay? That really hit me. And that gave me a sense of, my God, we really could move beyond all of these things that we all get so caught up in. If that human being right there with all the stuff, I mean, just the physical brutality that he was confronted with, just that alone would be enough to just leave anybody with a nightmarish life for the rest of their life. But for him to be able to put aside all the physical trauma and to put aside the emotional trauma and to just keep his eye, well, not to sound corny, but to keep his eye on the prize, you know, which was his view that we should all get past all of these things. Bruce, to me, I think that is the point, that the notion is now beyond that. It is to this larger universal appeal to humanity now. Because being a high school teacher, my teenage students, they're there. They look at the world. They're not looking from the much more provincial perspective that even I look from, you know, because I'm just a poor kid from a little farming town ultimately. And I got out, you know, I got my diploma and I went to college and did something with myself. And I was born in '68, and I always use that as kind of a joke that with my kids, it's like, there's a reason why I'm just so terrible. I was born in the worst year in human existence, apparently. 1968, and the kids always laugh about that, but then we study it a little, like, oh my God. I said, yeah, so if you ever want to blame anything about the future, just blame me, because apparently it's my fault, because I was born then.
Thank you, Mr. Corling. I appreciate it.
Just wanted to get that. John Lewis, I think, really set up, Bruce, what you're talking about. I think he was even to that point. So
we'd like to open it up to everyone now, but just first, a very quick comment about Rabbi Susan in St. Louis. And then also Liz Egra has something that she'd like to say, but just a brief comment about St. Louis. So I have a nephew who's in St. Louis, and he's active in Rabbi Susan's congregation. There were two incidents recently. One, Jewish cemetery was vandalized a couple of years ago in St. Louis, and the Black community and the Muslim community came together in support of them and did a lot to raise money for repair. Also, there's a white supremacist who literally lives next door to the synagogue, who's been vandalizing the temple, and there's a restraining order against him. And again, the Black and Muslim community have gotten together for that incident as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Liz and then everyone else after that. And Lynn Berkeley Baskin is going to moderate the chat room. You can either, would you prefer people to raise their hands, or do you want to put questions?
Well, I think we do have to have some protocol here, since there's so many of us on the call. If we could just show your hand, if you want to show your hand like this, or we'll be monitoring the chat, monitoring the chat as well. And again, this is for us to ask the 5 presenters questions. And as much as we would love to hear everyone's story, it's a difficult time with so many of us. And so there have been comments already made in the chat that perhaps we could do this in some other venue, in some other space where we can share our stories together. But today is intended to hear our 5 panelists and what they think and what they believe, so that we can learn from them. And then we can perhaps do this at another time where we can share our stories. So for now, if we could see your hands, if you have a question for one of our panelists, or of course be in the chat. And then I'm going to turn this over to Liz just for a moment. She wants to share a piece of this that is important to her.
I will not tell my story, nor how I come to this, to being, like many of you, a lefty and a Jew, and but I'm an accidental American. It is very evident here that we're talking generations, and I want to ask the panel, what would be the best way to bring the experiences of us, those who lived in the 60s as impressionable teenagers and budding adults, because that's who we were. And the generation that came after us, and bring those, skip that generation or involve that generation in reaching the young people of today who live on media immersion and are much more involved in, what could I say, in the electronic world and appearances. And
Liz, I can tell you with Spill the Honey Foundation, we have students across the country. Our foundation uses the arts to promote human dignity. So they're creating rap songs. Somebody had asked, what's the end of our song? Well, we were reading together with a Spelman, phenomenal rapper, and we were studying When Heschel Met King, and she literally, after we studied all together, we were kind of writing down some things, and she came up with Zarina with this amazing rap song, right, from studying. And the young students are putting a newsletter, it's going out throughout the country. And Rev Kev, I'd like to get you involved. Dean Carter is working with us with Morehouse, and we're doing this Thursday night. We had Isaiah Thomas a couple weeks ago and Ambassador Young, and this week we have Amar Studemeyer. We're looking at sports justice. So we're kind of going where the kids are at. But the kids are coming up with all this creativity. So they're like on this newsletter, anything that's related to like racism and anti-Semitism, they're kind of putting up together like dates in history. And so they're co-creating this exciting curriculi, transmission and kind of going where the kids are at. So thank God we've got this going on. But, I invite all of you to help in any way. And Dean Carter is very much leading this.
okay, I understand the emotional response of the kids. We've had kids create plays, art, etc. That is not enough. And I am asking Bruce Haynes, because I think as an educator, you kind of sense what I'm feeling. The response is very timely and in the language of the time, response to a situation, not from deep knowledge of where all of that has come from. And do you think that it's enough?
Well, I guess I think part of the problem is that in the post-1980s environment where we've had this massive amount of immigration, it's the new immigrants and their problems that we've paid attention to, right? So we talk about Islamophobia, but we don't talk about anti-Semitism in a sense. And so some of that has to do with, an education system that doesn't like to go too far back into history. So, at this point, I guess now it's left to the historians or the social scientists to now teach about the Holocaust in a way that I think it was much more prevalent across our entire society back in the 70s. I mean, you turned on PBS on any evening and you could find something on Hitler or the Holocaust or the Civil Rights Movement, or Eyes on the Prize. They don't see any of that. In fact, they don't know too much about the Civil Rights Movement either. They mostly have impressions and talk about the impressions that they have about the past, but in terms of details, that's where I hope to help them out in the classroom. But I would actually turn back to Eric, the high school educator there, to talk about how we maybe would try to address this, because I think it has to happen before they get to the university.
Something really dynamic is happening at our school where we're seeing a radical demographic change on campus. So the student population is becoming more and more diverse, and that is causing a lot of excitement, but it's already caused a few what were essentially little tiny things that blew up in all of our faces. And what was nice to see was how immediately the kids turned things around. They wanted to see us as the faculty and administrators kind of organize some things, and we did do that. But from my perspective, at any rate, for as much as I tried to do, just being out on campus and watching the kids actually deal with everything, they did most of the lifting, because they seem to have a vested interest in a world that is more inclusive, and they really get it, and they don't necessarily, like you were just saying, they don't necessarily have this deep historical knowledge or anything. They get it without having all of that, and when they do see it, like in my history classes or in my literature classes, and I try to teach that particular stuff, that just solidifies more for them this feeling they already have. And I think the problem for them today is because they don't necessarily have that deeper knowledge to it, they can kind of be easily distracted or derailed by a lot of the social media portrayal of the past, which is, totally unreliable for the most part, because any nutty out there can put anything up anywhere and suddenly it goes viral and everybody thinks that's the truth when it's just not. Right. So that I think is probably the biggest problem, is how to disseminate the truth, but still keep this fire that the kids have.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, Kevin.
I would love to tag on that. Absolutely, Eric. There is this sense among this present generation, Generation X, Generation Y, generation, the millennial generation, especially in Z, of belonging to each other because they grew up in the most connected time in human history with the internet. And so kids are playing video games across the world with one another, irrespective of these artificial barriers. It's, are you a great game player? Can you game? The definition of space has changed, the definition of community has changed. And so as we start looking into what does space look like for the generations that will ultimately have to carry the mantle, what does community look like for them, and begin to think of ways in which we can share, learn from them. Because I think that sense of belonging that they have among themselves, and I've observed it on my staff, I've observed it in the communities in which we work in. Of course, we're seeing it across the country and the world now. What I have observed is that because they don't hold a lot of the vitriol from the past, some of the history, some of the things that keep us paralyzed from coming together, from slowly, they don't have those pains. And I think we have to be very careful within our own worlds, not in the classroom. I think we have a lot of work to get the history correct. And I will speak on behalf of Black history within the United States, talking about, and really it's American history, if we want to be honest. When we talk about the history of slavery, we always like to talk about it as if it's Black history, but it's really American history.
Definitely inextricable.
With a cast of Blacks, playing roles in it. But I think that has to occur. But I also think that in our homes and in our communities and in our synagogues and churches and places and spaces, that we have to be very careful not to transfer the bitterness and the pain and the anguish that we have as we educate them about the past, because that's how they learn. We were in a dialogue recently with my colleagues. I've been doing a lot of these dialogues on race, but at American Leadership Forum, and one of our colleagues spoke up about the fact that he and his father bonded. This is a white male. He and his father would get in the car in the 60s and go to in town. The father taught him about in town. This is in town, the in word. The father would teach him about in town, and they would drive and they would go to in town, and the father taught him how to make fun of ins and all this and that. And so one day they went to church, and they go to church, and the son, being very young, says, "Hey, Dad, are we going to stop by in town after church?" And the clergy and everybody in there just kind of froze. There was this moment of, and looked at the man with kind of this shame. And he went home and talked to his son and said, "You know what, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that kind of thing anymore. That wasn't the best thing for me to teach you." So I just want to share that part of creating this intergenerational trust and this intergenerational learning. I think it's important that we be cautious not to transfer our biases and our bitterness, and maybe borrow some of their optimism, and borrow some of their or learn from some of their ways of belonging. Because I think this is going to be an intergenerational solution that helps bring us into
Kev, I'd love to jump in here.
Yeah.
We have some questions too, gentlemen. Excuse me one second. We also have some questions from folks. So please, I would love for the two of you to finish that part of the conversation, but there are lots of questions coming in.
Well, I just wanted to comment, I teach exclusively race relations. That's what I've been teaching for 25 years in all predominantly white institutions, NYU, Yale, Hunter College, Davis. And so I'm used to teaching non-Black students about race. So the first thing I think, whoever's teaching it has to be comfortable in their own skin. If they're not, the students are going to read it just like an animal reads your fear. So if you are not comfortable, that's number one. Number two, we are in a society in deep, deep, deep denial. And it's much like the denial that occurred during the Holocaust. Like we know what's going on, but we don't want to really look too hard, because if we actually look, we might see something we don't want to see. So, Americans are deeply, the thing I get from my students is God, I've taken so many classes, and why didn't anybody ever tell me this before? That's what I get from my students, because I tell them about how deeply embedded racial violence is in our society. I talk about the period of racial cleansing that occurred in the late 19th century, right? So it has to go beyond just talking about, redlining and class and keeping it sanitary and nice. This was a deeply violent society that used violence to construct the segregation that we now live in. And if we cannot reconcile that history, that's kind of, to me, where the rubber meets the road. So I go for the juggler. And I'm telling you, some students will walk out the first day, but the students who care really want to know. And they really, as you said, they really get it. They get it, because I talk about, Armenians, I talk about, this is a human issue. And if you cannot sort of show that there's this commonality across these categories, then to me, I've lost the battle. So that's really the key to me in the classroom, is showing that, oppression is oppression, poverty is poverty, violence is violence. It doesn't matter who it's being perpetrated against.
I think that's a very idealistic way of talking about it, but I think we must contextualize it.
Oh, no. It has to be with rich history. You have to know your history to do what I do.
Yeah, okay. Because I'm particularly speaking about this present generation. They crave authenticity, and so, it's important that we, as we're doing that we're also speaking to the present suffering as well, in very particular ways that it's going on, and how we're going to engage the dismantling of it, because it's hard for us to see the glorious ideal when the particular is my lived experience, and so that's
that we have to talk about, poverty in the here and now while we teach them about poverty yesteryear. We have to talk about labor struggles in the here and now while we teach them about labor struggles in the yesteryear. This is what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
Thank you both. This is amazing, and I think one of the reasons we know this is so good is because in all of this discussion that we're having, we're all feeling a little uncomfortable. So we know we're moving ahead when we're feeling a little bit uncomfortable about what's being said. So this is really wonderful. I'm going to turn it over to each person as they put their question in the box and in the chat box. So I'm going to call on the person and we'll unmute you. And then you can ask your question to the panelists. So I'm going to start with Nancy Brodowski. Nancy, I hope you're still on, and I'm looking for you.
I am. It was great, and I especially love that Rev Kev highlighted ALF and what we're doing, because it's a great opportunity to be able to have a dialogue, and we get this a safe space in which to chat and learn from each other. My question was for Shari. Your film was really outstanding in terms of opening our eyes to a history that we really were not that aware of, or many of us, it sounds like tonight. We've all known snippets of things, but you really laid it out. So how do you plan to further distribute this? And I find that this type of experience, by watching the film, then having this chat, creates a chat effect, where then others will go and say, oh my God, oh, look what I did, did you know? And I got to do this, and this is great. Oh, you're interested? Oh, that's great. But how do we then share it to take it to the next step by using your film?
Well, like I said, we are building also, we need help because we are also looking to build a curriculum around the 80 other hours. But with this particular film, we're going from state to state in the Jewish film festivals that are now partnering with the Black film festivals and the NAACP. Isaiah Thomas is going to hopefully bring this to the sports teams, to the NBA, and he said, you know, he thinks this film he thought was so important he didn't want it to get lost in the politics. I call on, you know, Rev Kev, and hopefully Bruce Haynes, like if we could get the ministers and the rabbis together to all see this film so that, I mean, you know, not that they have the discussion in their respective churches and their respective temples about it, and we can all sit together and have this kind of call to action. You know, I see this film as a social justice call to action for us to have these kind of conversations and to really figure out some legislation we can get behind to actually get something done. So it's steps. You know, you've got to take small steps, but it's first learning our history, having dialogue. We already have college students who are becoming ambassadors and leaders in this Black Jewish coalition on the college campuses. But I call you guys to help any which way we can to, you know, to kind of bring a coalition of conscience together of people who want to talk about this history, but there's so much power in pulling together. So to speak, like it took the 50th anniversary of the Selma and Montgomery March to kind of spark a lot of people to now talk about this building of how our communities came together. I mentioned when we got together before is Rabbi Sal Berman. He's an Orthodox rabbi at Columbia University who teaches on ethics. He was in Selma. He was called by Heschel and he was in jail. And it took the 50th anniversary for him to say, you know what, I've sort of dropped the ball a little bit, that I haven't used my own personal experience in Selma to teach my Orthodox or other Jews about this history that I was in. So, you know, I think this film can be used in that way. So I ask for your help to help me get the word out, and that's all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Happy to.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. So I think the next person would be Tammy Hance. Are you there, Tammy? There you
Hi.
go.
Oh, goodness. Well, I was just saying first of all, I'm extremely humbled in the presence of such credentials. I'm a baby boomer that was really too young to, I was barely a baby boomer. I was born in '62. So I do remember some of the events that happened, but from a child's perspective. But anyway, I'm mainly coming to this with an interest in how can I make a difference with my little unimportant life as a daycare teacher, just trying to bring whatever I can forward into the lives of the children and the families that I work with. Practical suggestions.
I have one for you. Normalize excellence. So one of the things that is happening in daycares and preschools, etc., is story time. Story time is a way in which we create and share information with little ones, and they start to formulate worldviews. And so make sure that you have a diverse selection of children's books. Not that I have written one recently at all called The Optimistic Steed, A Story of Resilience, but I couldn't resist.
Got the plug.
But that was the plug. But the point is this normalizing of excellence, that you're able to present various forms of literature to children, and in their worldview is being rounded out, and they're beginning to appreciate the stories from our Jewish heritage and our Black heritage and our social justice struggles. And there's a ton of books out there like that, but I would just start with story time. That's a simple way to get started. Just telling the stories of the various peoples of the worlds that you're committed to building.
Thank you. Yeah, I do what I can in that regard. Our theme this year is that we're global kids, and so we're learning about cultures all around the world. But I think there's almost too much of an emphasis in some ways in reaching for, you know, things far away instead of having a chance to put some focus on things that are going on all too locally and, you know, in real life, as the kids would say,
Yeah.
in real life here around them.
Right. Well, there's a plethora of books. One of the places, you know, there's an organization that I'm just beginning to work with called Raise a Reader. They are a national organization that serves 130,000 children in low-income areas from across the country, and their whole purpose is to connect adults with books that they can read out loud to children. And so maybe take a look at Raise a Reader and look at their offerings, because I know a number of those books that they have do tell the stories of Blacks and minority communities in beautifully illustrated ways and such.
Okay, thank you very much.
I have one other very practical suggestion. Make sure you have photographs of African Americans and Jews and other cultures, not just sports figures, but a lot of things on your walls. It's a great way to deal with implicit bias, to make sure that people really come to understand that people in all walks of life have good stories. And of course, there's The Bridge that was written by John Lewis that may be for a slightly older group, but it's a wonderful multi-volume book.
Okay, thank you.
Along the same lines, exposing them to authority figures, you know, whether they be Black politicians, Black musicians, you know, people, as Rev Kev said, who represent excellence, but also represent diversity in being able to accomplish excellence.
Thank you very much.
All great suggestions. Thank you all. I'm going to move to Andrea Rosen. I think I saw you. There you are. There we go. Excellent. Go ahead, Andrea.
Thank you. So Shari, your film was amazing. And as many people can see it, the more people who can see it, the better. I guess what it reminded me of, and I grew up in what used to be called Santa Clara Valley, now called Silicon Valley. And my rabbi walked with Martin Luther King, and we were very involved in civil rights. And one of my best friends was the only white leader of the San Jose NAACP. She was entrusted as a secretary. And we not often, but we occasionally went to San Jose Black Students Union and listened to Harry Edwards, who was a professor of sociology at San Jose before he went to Berkeley. So we tried to be as aware and as involved as we possibly could as a Jewish community. The problem I think the main problem I think your film underscores and that we're facing, and that I think we all need to put our heads together about, is that those personal connections between Black leaders and Black people of that era, and white leaders, white Jewish leaders, and white Jewish people of that era do not exist for the most part. And Bruce made a very good point that it's in large part because of persistent segregation of our neighborhoods and our cities. So how do we overcome that? If we're going to continue, if we're going to try and do half of what our Black and Jewish forebears did in the 60s civil rights movement, if we're going to try and rebuild that in order to bring our strengths together, how are we going to do that? I think for me, I spend time thinking about it, and it's tough. We're also discussing it in our neighborhood. I'm very involved with the neighborhood association, and we've talked a lot about, you know, the color line that caused our neighborhood to be largely white. I think this is the toughest nut to crack right now for us.
I don't know about York, but city like, and I live in Michigan, Detroit is becoming very integrated in terms of like, you know, there's hope. I think in the cities, I think people like to be around culture. I think that there's grassroots organizations, as I said, going on from state to state, that I think people realize that there had been sort of, as Heather Booth said in our film, there was a, you know, kind of a hiatus of this kind of coalition. And I think people recognize that we all sort of dropped the ball. And I think having this Black Jewish caucus and having these grassroots efforts in state to state, I think we need to work on it and find legislation that we can find common goals. While we have differences now, we had differences back then. You know, think about the Jewish immigrants. They didn't even speak English, you know, when they came here, but there was enough that everybody knew it was in their best interest to work towards that common goal. So I think we just need to, it's grassroots. I mean, think of now we have social media, we have Twitter, we have more access to really coming together than Dr. King and his, you know, coalition had. So I think I think it's setting a mindset that we're gonna do it, and then we'll just do it.
Well, but Shari, not to rain on your parade, because what you're saying is very optimistic. Here in California, one of the big problems is not just racial segregation, we also have deep, deep economic segregation. And I think the answer to your question might be affordable housing. As long as these all-white communities remain, you know, million-dollar home communities, they will remain all white. So until neighborhoods like my own in Davis have affordable housing that people of color can actually afford to live in, they're not going to live here. And so I really see that the rubber meets the road, with meaning that people are going to have to let, you know, people who are poorer than them live next door. That's what it will require for us to really desegregate our society. I really believe that. In part because class is so deeply entrenched racially. I mean, the two things historically are wedded. And we don't want to acknowledge that. We'd like to say, look, we just deal with this race problem, but I can keep all of my stuff. But the reality is that power must be shared if a disempowered group is going to get power from an empowered group. So we're talking about power, we're talking about money. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's what I see in these institutions, quite frankly, right? You know, my institution, UC Davis, we have all this stuff going on right now about diversity. But at the end of the day, until I see money for faculty and money to support my graduate students, it's all just symbolic. That's where we love to live in America, at that symbolic level. And we often don't go deeper. And I feel
Look at Bruce, what about the politics even in California? I mean, in terms of going back to Mayor Bradley and all the work that in terms of organizing to ensure that there were Black leadership and
Prop 13. The rubber meets the road in California with Prop 13. That's the thing that maintains class inequality. That's the one thing that maintains economic inequality, educational inequality, and it's the third rail of political life here, apparently.
Thank you. Rep Kev, did you want to say more?
Amen.
Okay.
He's telling the truth.
Yeah.
He's telling the truth.
It is. And actually, before I get to you, Muriel Brownstein, I would like to interject another question that was asked of earlier directly, privately, is that those friendships that happened during the 60s and the civil rights movement were built around an ideal and a common enemy. And what is that today? What is that today? And so in other words, I think part of the question had to do with how can we, if we are going to rebuild that, we also need that same kind of context of fighting a common enemy.
White supremacy.
That's it. That's the bottom line.
Amen.
And I believe, I believe that, we haven't allowed much of the observation on what this current generation is doing. This current generation sees that. they are building alliances across race and religion. We've got to, I think there's some study that we need to do as far as that is concerned, that the generation that has found each other, and they've broken out of those prisons of fear. They don't buy the BS. They can call it what it is very fearlessly. They don't have anything to lose. And so, but they do want a collective freedom. When I have a birthday party at my house for one of my kids, it looks like the United Nations in my backyard. That is very common, a common reality for me, right? And I think that kind of world is invisible. And so I think that there must become a great emphasis on studying the ways in which this emergent generation have found each other and are building ways to work together. And I'm not saying let's abandon some of the ways that we know of coming together, but maybe there's something there to be, learned in order to get there. And the other thing is our common enemy is white supremacy and systemic racism in the United States. And we need our Jewish relatives to say that out loud, and then use your power and platforms to dismantle it in the places and spaces where you have influence. I mean, in a real clear way. And you can count on the Black community and our leadership to be a part of standing with you in doing that, because we know that we all benefit when that occurs. The chant "never again" really takes on a greater meaning when we know that we've attacked it structurally and not symbolically. We get at it at the root. And I know it's terrifying for some to say that out loud, to break that kind of silence for what you may have to risk. But one of the things that we learned in the film, these great relationships that were established, became established around a daily awareness that I may not live to see tomorrow, but I don't want my children to inherit this deeply divided and hate-based world, And so I think that this is the lean in point that I think we get to come to. And I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Rev Kev. I think we have one more question that we'll be able to get to this evening, and I apologize. We have many more questions than we do time. So thank you all. I think this next question, Muriel Brownstein will ask, and then we'll have people close with final comments.
Thank you. My comments are for whoever would like to answer. I absolutely support racial justice, but what bothers me, two things. One, the Black Lives Matter movement is anti-Israel and therefore to me anti-Semitic. And number two, with worldwide anti-Semitism rising, I don't feel that we're getting enough support from the Black community, and I didn't notice any Black members in the audience tonight. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I would love to comment.
Danielle is waving in the audience, and I want to just recognize that she is here in the audience. And Danielle Black, raise your hand so people can see you. There you go. Don't want to forget it.
I think you're asking a really important question because this stuff has come up. Recently, Deshaun Jackson and some other celebrities have engaged in some anti-Semitic language. But if you actually look, I have a piece on ESPN that condemns that, as did Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and a number of other people who wrote op-eds and public things to condemn that. The other thing is we often confuse two different social movements, Black Lives Matter and the Movement for Black Lives. So this organization called the Movement for Black Lives, they're the one who has this platform about Palestine. I really don't know too much about them, but they are not Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is very much a decentralized organization. so that, Sacramento's Black Lives Matter is nothing like Davis's Black Lives Matter. So they just call themselves by that name, but there is no organizing entity called Black Lives Matter. See what I'm saying? So in other words, I could start a faction today and call it Black Lives Matter. I don't have to contact anybody. It's not official from any institution. So there may be individuals in Black Lives Matter that have opinions about Palestine, but they don't represent the organization in any way. But the movement for Black Lives, they have engaged in support for Palestine in ways that many Jews might find anti-Semitic.
Thank you, Bruce.
I think that there have been always been put a wedge
Brian,
between
we're not able to
between-
hear you. If you could turn off your camera again, perhaps we'll be able to hear just your audio.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so there's always been efforts to kind of drive a wedge between Black community and the Jewish community. I think we just have to realize that they're not monoliths, and that there are going to be some people in each community who are going to say things that we don't like. I think what we need to do is to find those common spaces and try to work on them. And I don't think we should expect that. I don't know, that I was involved in an earlier time in an effort when a Jewish leader said, well, I'm not going to talk to you unless you disavow Louis Farrakhan. Well, that became the end of a conversation. I think we have to be careful not to get into that mode. So I agree that there have been efforts to drive that kind of a wedge, but I don't believe that the Black community as a whole is anti-Semitic or that we should treat it that way.
I think that's an important statement to be made and heard tonight, and deeply reflected upon and looked at very carefully, because it is the chasm. It is the stopping point of conversation when we determine who and how far you can think. We don't want to move from one form of bondage to another form of bondage. So in order for me to be your friend, you get to own a degree of space in my mind for the ways in which I can think about. And that's the troubling part that kind of makes it very brittle for us to build. So I think that's an excellent point to lift up. The other thing about this subject, somebody brought it up earlier about having met John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, who recently made his transition, and in meeting him found that he had no bitterness in him, and given all that he had experienced, he was just effervescent. I found that to be the case with meeting President Mandela in South Africa and South African freedom fighters. And then upon reflection, I find it to be our way as Black people, that it is not our way to be bitter. If we were seeking revenge rather than justice, okay? If we were seeking revenge rather than justice, what we would see, I can't imagine what revenge would look like given the atrocities that Black people have faced in the United States. So we have a way of turning the other cheek. We have a way of putting it down. It doesn't mean that we are not angry about the things that we're experiencing. And Jewish brothers and relatives should not be afraid of Black anger when you very well can relate to what that anger and that rage and that pain and that disappointment. I think a lot of times it breaks down there as well, because I don't want to piss off any Black people because they might do this, that, and the other. But the reality is that pain anger and rage for hundreds of years of oppression in this country should be expected. It should be expected when we get to witness other people in mass live freely. So it should be an understanding that there may be pain, there may be rage, but it is not pain and rage and hurt and trauma for the sake of being vengeful. But it is a condition that continues to perpetuate itself, that we need our Jewish relatives who understand very well what this is about to become more vocal, become more engaged, and stand alongside us as we do as well. And I want to make one last point. A lot of the when we say, well, we haven't heard Black people condemn this statement or condemn that statement. As I mentioned before, a lot of our relationships and the ways in which we take stands are invisible. Often it's not attractive to the media to show up at some of our events, but we're there and we're doing this work anyway. And so let's assume positive intent on either side. And I think that's a good entry point for us working together.
I guess I still didn't feel like I got an answer. Is why is there not a louder Black voice against anti-Semitism?
I just sent out an article that I wrote. I'm an academic. I wrote in the venues that I can write in. That's about as loud as I could be. Other Black intellectuals have also written in places like the New York Times and other places. But
Clarence Jones did as well, by the way.
I think what you're doing, though, if I'm not mischaracterizing it, is in some ways creating a litmus test. And this is the problem that I think splits the conversation between the Jewish community and the Black community. People can't say to me, look, unless you disown Louis Farrakhan, I can't have a conversation with you. Well, that's not the conversation Blacks have with Jews. They say, well, look, Jews, you better disown Kahani or we can't talk to you. Why is it that Black people have to have this litmus test? That's the first point. Second point, we have a deep stereotype about criminalizes Black people that says Black people are angry, Black people are violent and out of control, they're childlike, and if it wasn't for the domesticating process of slavery, we'd be running around with our, like chickens with our heads cut off. And that's the way we were depicted in Hollywood, in fact, in movies like Topsy. So we have a deep history of creating some of the fears that you have about Black anger. And this is exactly the same fears that our president has been preying upon when he says, hey, they're coming to your neighborhood soon. So this is part of the deep racial conversation that we start to have to unpack if we are ever going to have an honest conversation about why, in fact, Jews and Blacks have so much in common. Because the problem here in America, if anybody has looked lately, is indeed white supremacy. And when you have anti-Semitism and racism, those two things seem to run together for some strange reason. And I just wanted to add, I also agree with Rev Kev, if there's one thing that I've learned as someone who did not grow up in the Black church, but who has studied Black culture and Black history, is that the Black religion has this uncanny ability to forgive the unforgivable. And that's what we saw in South Carolina with Mr. Dylan Ruth.
I think the section that I put in the film is called Strength to Love, where Zenona Clayton comes in and she tells a wonderful story that didn't get into the film about how I think it was Dr. King she had met with the head of the Ku Klux Klan every single day for an entire year, and he finally turned around. I mean, it was her mission they would just meet. And it was just, she learned so much from Dr. King, and she tells a beautiful story that didn't get in the film about strength to love and that philosophy.
Dr. King says we have to have a tough mind and a tender heart. And that's in the book you just referenced. I just want to read one piece.
And Bruce, before you do that, I'm just going to pause because I think it's a really important piece that you're going to read. After you do that, I'm going to pass it to Liz. So I'm going to stop the questions because I'm going to end with this beautiful piece that you're reading.
Oh, thanks for presuming it's going to be beautiful. Okay.
Well, when I said beautiful, I don't mean beautiful. I meant important.
Okay, and that too. When we, through compassionless detachment and arrogant individualism, fail to respond to the needs of the underprivileged, the Master says, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. So for me, that's where, you know, our two traditions line up.
Thank you. Thank you. Liz, I'm going to pass it to you to close us out and have people make final comment.
Oh my gosh. So I still want to be in your class, Bruce. I am moved to action, moved to make some plans. And I think this has been the most inspirational, if not conclusive, kind of meeting that we've just had. It's a beginning. It really is only a beginning. I want to thank Danielle Black, our fellow, for identifying herself as being African American, Black, whatever you want to call her. She is just so solid. She don't care, right? Amazing scholar, teacher, and dear friend. I'm sorry she did not share her wisdom. I think this conversation was important and not conclusive. Please, let's talk again.
Yes.
I feel inspired and motivated, and I hope everybody else is as well. Thank you to Shari and our panelists. Tevin, the one who brought us together, has a lineup of wonderful films, some entertaining, most educational. There is an animated classic, An Animal Tale, that will be at the drive-in on October 18th. And October 22nd to the 27th is another very instructional piece, They Ain't Ready for Me. Speak of dealing with discrimination on multiple levels. Sunday, November 15, Imagining the Indian, the fight against Native American mascoting. We are all aware of that as we look at different sports teams, etc. November 30th to December 6th, the film Cooked, Survived by Zip Code. I have not seen that one, nor do I know much about it, so it's a must for me. I hope you'll join me. Please see the film series website posted on the chat window for more information. Thank you all for participating and being part of this unique opportunity to look at the world through many different glasses. Thank you. Hope to see you all again.
And an honor to be on the panel. Thanks, Tevin. And thanks, Shari.
Thank you. Shalom. Peace.
Peace.
I hope when we all come together again, like in Atlanta, we had Peter Yarrow sing Blowing in the Wind, but we had Reverend Warnock's, the Ebenezer Church Choir, and then we had the Temple Choir, Raphael, right, and the the temple choir, Rabbi Berg, and they came together. And there's something about music and coming together is just extraordinary. So in coming together with a diverse community and watching the film and experiencing that in that way, it's really, it's a good feeling. And I welcome you and to help in any which way you can, because we're really looking at this as an educational opportunity. And I look forward to having any of your emails and corresponding with you. And this is the beginning.
Absolutely. Is it a way to capture the chat so that if we enter information in the chat room that we can maybe send it out to everyone or whoever is, I see Judy saying yes. Okay, I can put my information there for those who want to contact me. And this has been rich. It's been wonderful. And we're cooking. You can feel the temperature boiling. That's when something's getting ready to happen. You know, you want to break out in song. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Yeah, we got it.
Thank you all.
Bless you, Rev Kev. Bless you.
Blessings to you. Look forward to meeting you all in person and building on tonight. This was rich.
Absolutely.
Our ancestors are happy tonight.
Pleasure.
Blessings.
I'll leave all my information with the Jewish Film Festival if anybody wants to reach me. Thank you. This is the beginning anyway, so I'm excited.
Oh yeah, Lynn and Tevin know how to track us all down.
All right. And I'm just typing mine in there just to be sure.
Good night, everyone, and thanks for staying around.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good night all, and thank you, Shari and Tevin, for the film and for bringing us together.
And you, Judy, thank you.
Always.
Thanks, everyone. This has been great.
Judy, thank you so much.
Good night, all.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.